He was chief of staff to Toronto's most infamous mayor, one of the few in his inner circle that was known to be imploring the mayor to seek help. For his troubles, he was frog-marched out of City Hall, fired. Mark Towhey lays it out in a new book he's co-authored with journalist Johanna Schneller. It's called Mayor Rob Ford, Uncontrollable: How I Tried to Help the World's Most Notorious Mayor. And Mark Towhey and Johanna Schneller join us now for more. Welcome, you two.
Hey.
Good to be here.
I gotta say, boy, this is a frightening read. This is a very, very frightening read, and we're going to go through it now. But before we get to the nuts and bolts of the book, I want to sort of talk a bit about some of the rules of the road and how you two collaborated. Let's start there. I think it's fair to say that it's sort of one of the unwritten rules of being a political advisor, that in exchange for getting fabulous access to a great job and all of the decision makers, that one of the, and you of course give your unfiltered advice, in return, you have to kind of observe a rule of omerta. And you've kind of blown that rule to smithereens here by writing a very candid, horrifying book about your time in the mayor's office. Why did you break the omerta?
There's nothing in the Rob Ford mayoralty or the campaign that was orthodox in any way, shape, or form. But you're right. I mean, the typical orthodoxy would be absolutely would I not say anything. And when I walked out of the mayor's office after being fired on the 23rd of May in 2013, that's exactly what I expected to say, which was nothing. Having said that, over the next year, pretty much everything that it was that I wasn't saying became public. It became public through court documents. It became public through some very good investigative journalism.
There's
and
lots
some
of stuff in here, Mark, that goes well beyond stuff that I've read elsewhere.
There is. Well, what I tried to do with the book is to take the stuff that's public and connect it together with some connective tissue, the missing pieces that help you understand, I think, what really happened. Because there's a lot of stuff that Rob did that I would argue was very good policy, was very good governance. And that's been forgotten because we remember the last Rob Ford we saw, which was the addict. And there are some things about his addiction that I think people didn't understand in terms of his relationship with his family that I think put it into a little bit of context, maybe as a warning to others, but certainly to help understand what actually happened.
Now, conversely, your job as a journalist is to get as much out there as possible, so you've probably got to be thrilled with what came out here. Having said that, you know, he liked Rob Ford initially, and I'll bet you didn't. And he liked his agenda, still liked his agenda, I'm sure, and I bet you didn't.
Yeah.
So why did you want to be part of this?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I'm an American, and I've watched my country sort of, you know, just entrench itself more and more and more in this complete and total partisanship. And I just think that's a ridiculous way to go about things, especially as a journalist. We should always be trying to understand one another and understand what the other person is thinking and how it all works. And so Mark and I share an agent. And when that agent came to me and said, would you like to consider this? I said, does Mark know that my politics and his politics are probably as far apart as they can be? And is he willing to collaborate with the likes of me? And the fact that he was, I think, really says a lot about him, because he knew I was going to ask him those questions, and he knew that I wasn't going to let anything rest. And in fact, you know, he did let me insert my own views and help moderate his views. And then I feel like somewhere in between we came to a more true truth than we would have either one of us done separately, because I really learned a lot about the way he thought and the way that school of thought worked, and I feel like he saw a bit of my side as well.
But just so I understand the relationship here, did you actually, I mean, I know you took, when you were in that job, you took copious notes, and the results of those notes are in this book. But did you actually write the book?
No, it was very much a collaboration right down the middle. Mark would write the first draft of every chapter, and then he'd send it to me, and I'd send it back peppered with questions, and then he'd we sent it back and forth to each other a couple times, and that went on for about a year, I would say.
What did you argue about, you and she?
Not a whole lot, but there were a lot of places where we went back and forth on adjectives. Like, I don't think I would have called Rob that yet. Maybe later, yes, but at this point, no. A lot of, I think if we had published my first draft, the book would be 7,000 pages long. So I would write 10,000 words in a chapter about the subway situation, and Johanna would come back very politely and say, you know what, these 3,000 words are interesting.
The other 7? Not so much.
Not so much.
Yeah, I got it.
But the other thing that I really thought Johanna brought to the table, and what I really wanted when I spoke with the agent, said, I think maybe we bring somebody else in from a journalist background. I wanted an honest broker. And she did push me in a lot of places. There were some areas, particularly around some of the family stuff, I wasn't that comfortable talking about at first.
You're talking about yourself?
Yeah, a little bit of that,
you mean
but
his
also with
family?
his family.
His family,
But
okay.
without that, Johanna was pointing out, the story doesn't make sense if you don't have some of this in here. And so there was a lot. She did an excellent job, I think, of making sure that I didn't leave stuff out just because it was uncomfortable.
Well, one of the uncontrollable, that's an adjective, right? Uncontrollable, he clearly was, but that I inferred from that his job is to control politicians. Because if this guy was uncontrollable, his job is to control. Is that right? Is that what he does for a living? Control politicians?
I think control in that situation is too strong of a word, because I think most people are more willing to be guided, and most people who aren't addicts have a better sense of self-preservation and things like that. I think when you add an addiction to the mix, then words like control start to make a lot more sense. I mean, I don't think anybody's trying to, brainwash anybody or be a puppeteer. I think Mark was always trying to make Rob be the sort of best version of himself that he could possibly be. And when all else, when all of his ability to have any kind of impulse control disappeared, then the issue of control starts to matter.
You know what? It's even more than that, though, Mark, because his personal travails are well documented. But one of the things that's starting to emerge in your book and in John Fillion's book as well is your chief of staff to a politician, to the politician who got more votes than any other person in this country, not ever, but up there. He doesn't know why he wants that job. How does Rob Ford become the mayor of Toronto not really knowing why he wants to be mayor?
I think he thinks he knows why he wanted to be mayor. I mean, and when I first asked him that question when I first met him, it was like he dissembled, and it went immediately to, well, everybody tells me I should be mayor.
Right. That's no reason, though.
No. And then it's basically to represent the little guy, and he stayed that. But more interesting, and I don't think it didn't even really make it into the sort of the final draft of the book, but I asked him that question very late in our relationship when it was clear that he was struggling with addictions, and I was talking with him about that after the court cases when he very nearly became not the mayor. And he focused, all he wanted to do once his addiction sort of became the topic of our discussion was just focus on the ground game, focus on the campaign. And I asked him, why do you even want this job? Why do you want to win again?
What did he say?
He really didn't have an answer for that, but after a long time, to be honest, my sense, and this is my opinion of it, was Rob Ford wanted to be mayor so that nobody else was mayor. And
that's a very odd reason to want to be mayor.
Yeah, and when I looked at him compared to the candidates in 2010 and to all the people that he was afraid might run in 2014, he didn't want any of them to win.
I'm going to use all the language that his critics have used and you have used. Okay, Rob Ford's a racist, wife-beating, alcoholic, drug-abusing, rageaholic, serious, dysfunctional family, sexual harasser, and a lousy boss on top of that. And this is a guy that you wanted to see be the mayor of the city. What does that say about your judgment?
I don't think he's all of those things, but in particular the wife beating. I've never seen any evidence of that. And that's part of why some of the story about the family situation in the house had to be included in the book, because that put some color on it. But to answer your question, when I met him out of the blue. I wasn't a big fan of his. I was interested in a job, quite frankly. And when I went through all of these things that had happened, and I dug up the story of the Orientals at the sleeping beside their machines, about the Air Canada incident, about the calls to his house, he had very credible answers for all of those. And some of them, there are politicians who've done stupid things with alcohol in the past and been reelected. So at that time, he wasn't that guy.
Have you ever worked for another politician who called you in the wee small hours of the morning and kept you on the phone for an hour and 40 minutes saying, I'm going to put a bullet in her head, I'm going to shoot her, I'm going to put a bullet in her head? I mean, come on.
Yes, but that's well into the investment of helping this guy achieve what he was elected to do. Okay.
You obviously did not vote for Rob Ford when you could, right? I think that's a pretty obvious statement. Did you come away from collaborating on this book with Mark, though, with a better understanding of why this guy was a folk hero to so many people?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I'm definitely of the Toronto that Rob Ford thought Toronto shouldn't only be, if that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we had these conversations about, there's a huge segment of people in Toronto who don't care whether or not City Hall has a green roof, or who will never go to the opera or whatever, and who really do want their potholes fixed, and they want a smooth commute to work every morning. And I would say to Mark, yeah, but they live in Toronto. Like, you have to be a suburb of something. There has to be an idea. There has to be something that holds the city together. And I'm not sure Ford ever cared about that so much, but what working with Mark helped me to understand is the mindset of those people, and there are a lot of people who live in Toronto who aren't part of that sort of downtown core central way of all thinking the same and all feeling the same that we sort of assume people do in Toronto. And so for me, it was an interesting way of kind of putting myself in the mind of other people who have freshly arrived in the city and who do just want things to work and who do think things ought to be simpler. And what Ford had a genius for was distilling down what everybody was trying to say into the most kind of common man language. And I think what people responded to about that was that it wasn't insincere. I think that he actually believed those things that he was saying, and I think he was able to convey to people that he believed them.
Well, clearly, he was the most authentic person in the race.
I think they smelled authenticity, and for a lot of people who were suspicious, and especially people who had come from other countries where no politician was trustworthy, he seemed refreshing. He seemed like a guy who meant what he said.
And let's not forget, Mark, the first year of his mayoralty, he was remarkably successful at getting his program through City Council, such as?
He did well in the first meeting. In the very first meeting, which is typically just a housekeeping meeting, where you catch up on bylaws and planning stuff that hasn't been done during the campaign. But in that very first meeting, he eliminated the $60 car registration tax. He passed the motions to make the TTC an essential service. He got the councillors to agree to cut their own budgets in half and to take a whole bunch of budgetary measures. And then very quickly after that, with more and more of that agenda, in that first year, we got probably 30-40% of the stuff that he had promised that people would remember that he promised done or underway. And the rest of the stuff, some of it came later with there was actually a subway announcement to build a subway on Shepherd with the Premier, with Karen Stentz, the chair of the TTC. All of that was in the works. The union agreement with the labor, that actually came to fruition after he'd started to wobble and internally within the office was being hard to manage.
Well,
But then everything kind of fell off the rails and the rest of the agenda got pushed aside.
What's the night shift?
The night shift is what we started to call these people that have influence with both Rob and his brother Doug after hours. We would, started during the campaign, we'd come up with a very clear plan of what the priorities were for the next week, what we were going to do first thing in the morning, what we were going to say, how it was going to unfold. We'd go home, we'd come back in the morning, and somebody had talked to Rob Ford, and somebody had talked to Doug Ford, and the plan was all changed. And the plan was often all changed in ways that were absolutely ludicrous, and so we'd spend half the day unchanging it back to where we'd gotten. And sometimes it was things that sounded good to start with, but things that we had already gone through with them and considered and discounted because they caused problems 3 moves down the chessboard. And but it's this group of people that have influence with them in their social lives, particularly at night, because Rob Ford doesn't sleep a lot, even clean and sober Rob Ford.
Let me pick up with that with Johanna. I think one of the things I'm going to remember from this book the most is the utterly astonishing relationship that Rob and Doug Ford have. They are brothers who clearly love each other, and from time to time clearly hate each other, who clearly have each other's back sometimes, and clearly want to stab each other in that back sometimes. Do you get this relationship better, having written 350 pages on it now?
The book was never supposed to be about sort of just Doug alone. I mean, it was all about sort of how Doug impacted Rob and what their relationship was like together. And, I have siblings. I understand that siblings can have rivalries and I think there was something about the power struggle between Rob and Doug that's really interesting, in that if you look at Doug on the surface, you might think he would be the more logical politician. You might think he's the better looking brother or the better spoken brother or something like that.
He dresses better, he's not as heavy, he's healthier,
Yeah, but yet there was something about him that people didn't quite warm to, whereas people warmed to Rob in a different sort of way. And for sure that would rankle someone like Doug, and for sure someone like Rob, who, as Mark pointed out, probably hated the spotlight more than any other politician as well. I mean, for a guy who ended up in the spotlight as much as he did, when he was well, he certainly didn't court it. You could turn the camera on almost anybody else instead of him, and he would have been happy about that. So I think he was, to watch their ebb and flow as brothers. I mean, one of the most astonishing things Mark told me was that Doug would occasionally go and sit in Rob's chair or sit in the boardroom, and Rob would just say, "Oh, well, we'll take our meeting somewhere else," or we can't use my office right now because Doug isn't there. He would just let it happen because he knew he was the mayor and Doug wasn't. And
can you give an example? But Doug thought he was sort of the co-mayor. Can you give an example of how he may have undermined Rob's agenda, either willingly or unwillingly, because he saw it as the people of Toronto electing the Ford family and not Rob Ford?
Yeah, Doug, one of the things that constantly irked me when I was in the office was the number of times people either on social media or media pundits or reporters would ask publicly and privately, why do they keep sending Doug Ford out to speak for Rob Ford? Do they not know how bad that looks? I can tell you absolutely 100% that there was no time ever while I was there that Doug Ford was ever sent out to speak for Rob Ford.
He just did it.
He just did it. And many times that caused trouble. Doug thought that us not speaking was a problem. We were quite happy to have left the last word, a positive word on message, going in the direction we wanted to be. And we were very happy with the way things were going. Even if people were being critical, the last word from Rob Ford that would be at the top of the article was exactly on point. And then Doug would go out and make a statement and muddy it up. And everybody would assume, because he's the mayor's brother, that he's speaking with some sense of official import. And really, he never was. He's a smart guy, but he wasn't always there for all of the planning. And so he was disconnected and too much of a rogue agent sometimes.
And Rob was, according to what I read, Rob was sometimes too afraid of his brother to go to him and say, stop that?
They did privately, but Rob would never say that publicly. And one of the conditions when I took over as chief of staff was that at some point, we've got to get your brother to not speak on your behalf, and we have to make it clear. And if you won't come out and say that, and when he does something that we need to undo, I want your permission that I can. And that time came not long after I was the chief of staff with regard to a promise Doug had made to trot out all of the junior staffers to tell them, the media, that they were volunteering for football. And I said, absolutely no way are we parading our junior staff through this sort of slaughterhouse, pardon me, of the media press gallery. That's not what they signed up for.
This is one of the things that Mark let me take out. Every time he wrote the word media, he would write media shark, media horde, media vulture, and I would just be like, media. We'll just call them the media.
Well, let's for people who don't live in Toronto, they may not remember that the mayor's office and the Toronto Star basically were at war.
Yes.
Almost for 4 years. I mean, they really were to the point where you canceled subscriptions, didn't tell the Toronto Star, where the mayor was going to be, and so on and so forth. And yet, every time a scandal came up, and it was splashed all over the front page of the Toronto Star, 60-point type for the headlines, you describe it as wind in our sails.
Yeah.
How exactly he rewrote the rules, obviously, on everything. How could all of those normally damaging headlines be wind in your sails for your campaign?
Well, it started during the campaign in 2010. And it started because we were going to have a number of negative headlines. We knew that. But, and Nick Kouvalis actually coined the term wind in our sails. And we just basically said, it doesn't matter what you throw at us. They dig up a 10-year-old marijuana charge. You know what? People will do anything, absolutely anything, to prevent this guy from stopping the gravy train. They'll dig up anything. They will say anything. They will, right? And people responded to that. And he wouldn't talk to the Star because of an article they wrote accusing him of having assaulted a football player. And they didn't say that wasn't in their voice. It was one of the people quoted in the article, but it had the impact of that.
Was the article accurate?
I don't know. I wasn't involved. We were able to unearth the kid that they talked about, the football player.
Who says it never happened.
Who says it never happened, and who says he's no fan of Rob Ford because if it happened, he would have beat the snot out of him, right? And so I tend to believe that guy. But because we weren't ever going to develop a rapprochement with the the Star, we kind of threw the textbook out and said, well, why don't we just build this into such an obvious McCoys and Hatfield feud that no one believes what they say?
Well, that's what I wonder. Has he now, because in spite of all that, he won. What was it,
383,501.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, as a card-carrying media shark, I mean, this was the most interesting part of the whole thing for me.
Has he redefined the relationship now between media and candidate and what you can get away with and still win?
You know, I would think, what is it going to take for people to stop liking this guy? Because time and time again, he would do these things. But what you're talking about in terms of the Star, it was as if every time we reported on something, we being the media, that he had done, people would blame the newspaper. They would say, oh, they're just picking on him again, or oh, they're just being mean to him again. Even though it was like, we're telling you what he did. Like, we're telling you what he said. We're not inventing this stuff. You know, we're just giving it to you. People would say, oh, leave him alone. Don't pick on him, blah, blah, blah. And that was one of the phenomenon that I really wanted to explore with Mark, because I just was like, I've never seen this before. And we're seeing a bit of it now in the States with Donald Trump.
And perhaps one of the differences with Donald Trump and Rob Ford is, in the case of Rob Ford, he actually had done the groundwork. He had done 10 years of returning phone calls and going out to people's porches and their backyards, and everybody knew that, and everybody in the family of that person knew that, and all their neighbors knew that. And so every time somebody in the media would say he couldn't possibly have returned 100,000 phone calls, 300,000 people knew that it was true, because he'd returned their phone call.
I'm going to read you something out of Now magazine, which you won't be surprised to hear is not a conservative publication in this city.
What?
Yes, this just in. Here's what Jonathan Goldsby wrote about this. Mark, it's about you. Towhey was a key player in everything that happened from the beginning of the 2010 campaign through to his firing in May 2013, and it's valuable to have his account on the record. But he also wants the book to serve as a cathartic, even therapeutic release for himself. Absent self-awareness and contrition, however, he can't possibly have an honest reckoning. Towhey wants us to pat him on the head and assure him he did everything he could to make a bad situation better. But instead, you kind of want to break it to him that, no, a lot of what happened is very much his fault, too. What do you think?
I know Jonathan Goldsby, invited him to my book launch, made sure that he came, and he did. That was good. Part of that's true. I mean, certainly for me, it is a bit cathartic. The book was never written with the intent that people would say, oh, Mark's a good guy. Because quite frankly, if you read it, there's a lot of points in there where I go, hey, I completely screwed this up. But I also think there's what seems to be happening in the minds of certainly Jonathan, because Jonathan was never a fan of Rob Ford to begin with, is people they didn't like the policies and the ideology that Rob Ford stood for, and no one liked the behavior as an addict. And I think the two things have become conjoined in their minds, and they can't separate them. And they hate him because he was always a drunk, and he was always but he wasn't, right? And I think it's normal for all of us to not like the addict that Rob Ford became, but I think it's quite reasonable for Jonathan and Now Magazine not to like the policy and the ideology. But you know what? A whole lot of people in Toronto did.
Indeed.
And I take full responsibility for helping prosecute that platform.
Now let me ask you about him, because he had the job as chief of staff. He probably knew that the mayor was driving drunk. He knew he was barely showing up for work. He knew he was using his staff inappropriately to make sandwich runs and this kind of stuff. He knew, or put it this way, he was pretty suspicious that there was some illegal drug activity going on. He knew about potential sexual harassment of employees in the mayor's office. Do you think he was an enabler of the mayor's behavior?
Yeah, a lot of people have asked that version of that question. And you know, part of my work in writing this book was to try to put myself in Mark's shoes and try to see it from that point of view. And I'm not sure how easy it would be for anybody to stand up to their boss. I think everybody thinks that it's easy to stand up to your boss, but when you actually think of blowing the whistle on your boss and what that means and what it's going to bring down upon the city and all the repercussions that it's going to have. And I think that what happens, not just to Mark, but to anybody, is you think, well, if I fix this part, then we can make it better enough that this part might, then we can work on that part. And I think that you keep holding out this hope that if you keep everything under control until everything gets straightened out, then you can straighten it out, and then it doesn't have to be all blown apart, and it doesn't have to all come to pieces. And I think that you do that the line keeps getting pushed and pushed and pushed. And
No, I sort of get it, Mark, because I mean, at one point you do describe a scene where he's got his arm up to your chest and he's got his fist cocked, and you probably think you're about to get plowed. Now, you probably go along with the boss when you think the boss is about to beat you up and the boss weighs 330, right? Fair point?
No.
No?
No.
That didn't have anything to do with it?
No, I'd take a little bit of issue with the premise.
Okay.
I would say that there was never an instance when I knew he was driving drunk, not once, not ever.
But you told staff in his office, don't you let that guy drive. Now,
That's
you must
right.
have given that directive for
That's right.
some reason.
That's because I didn't know that he wasn't. And it's very
Okay.
different.
Okay.
And I had a moral responsibility and a legal responsibility to protect the staff. And I confronted him about that and said, and he asked me, are you accusing me of driving drunk? And I'm saying, no, it's enough that I don't know that you're sober because there's an issue there. And I knew that the police, in fact, had told me they'd stopped him a couple of times, or more than a couple of times. They just kept hinting at this, that they'd stopped him. So I knew that it was happening in general. I was aware of 2 specific incidents where staff had observed him driving after drinking, or in one case, driving while drinking, both of which I heard well after the fact, and that's the basis upon which I issued that edict. You can't drive with him. And I approached him, and we made sure that. Had I ever seen him take a drink and step into a car,
No.
I would not only have called the police, I might have even arrested him. I've done that twice before in my career.
I don't mean to,
with my bosses.
I don't mean to come to. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
Like with who?
I arrested a major, the deputy commanding officer of the Rocky Mountain Rangers, when I was working there. He was drunk driving in an army vehicle.
When you were in the military.
Yep.
Okay. Do you know whether either of the Ford brothers has read this book?
I don't know, but I doubt it.
You don't think they will?
I don't think they will.
How much was left out? You mentioned that he writes 10,000 word chapters, and then, now did you clean up those chapters for to make them more readable, or did you leave stuff out of there because even that was too much?
I didn't leave out anything that you for reasons of as a journalist, I wanted to tell the best possible story. So mostly what we cut were it was sort of like Mark would give me a chapter, and then I would try to give it a shape and an arc the way one does when you're, and certain things would be repeated or unnecessary. The stuff that was the most significant was the stuff that we fought to keep in, and we had the book significantly looked at by an attorney, and we were not trying to pull any punches.
Okay.
We were trying to tell the truth.
Mark, based on the first year that Rob Ford had, when he was popular, in control of council, and I think at that time, basically clean and sober.
Yes.
Basically. Might have indulged in too much drinking every now and then, but basically clean and sober. Can you imagine what the 4 years of his mayoralty might have been like had he behaved himself?
He'd be mayor for life.
What would have got done?
He'd been mayor. Well, let me back that up, because even from the campaign, I was never convinced that he would be mayor for multiple terms. I figured if he stuck to his agenda that he had talked about, he'd be very successful in one term, possibly even get a second term. But at some point, because I think at the time in 2010, people didn't want the city to be that much better. It's a great city. We've already got so much good stuff. Just stop charging me more money for less of the same thing. And that was really the prevailing sentiment, I think, in most of the voters. And that's what he promised to deliver. And I believed even in the campaign that there would come a point where we'd done that enough that people would then want the vision for the next 20 years. And I wasn't convinced that Rob Ford was the vision for the next 20, 50, 100 years guy. There might be a better candidate come later on. But he could have stayed mayor for a long time.
I want to finish up on you personally.
Okay.
And I learned a lot about you. I mean, I know you a little bit just from politics, but I don't know you that well. And I learned a lot about you in this book. That was very distressing. This job ruined your health, made you clinically depressed, cleaned out your bank account at one point. I mean, you were broke at one point. You didn't know where your next meal or place where you were living in was going to be. You're a single dad to begin with. Was it all worth it, Mark?
I don't know how you compare that to what it could have been, right? But would I have changed a lot of it? It'd be nice to not work for an addict, but no, I think I learned a lot. I learned a lot about me. I had moments of depression in my life before this. Always I was able to get out of them. This kind of put me over the edge to the point where I needed to get help. I got help. That's a good thing for me. But it took an enormous toll on the other staff as well. Guys that haven't written books, some of them still struggle with issues. Some of them have been diagnosed with PTSD, and that's another reason why I wanted to tell the tale of the book, because they, through the information to obtain through the search warrants that got thrown out into the public sphere by the police through the courts, the stuff that's been reported, ad hoc bits and pieces, a lot of them feel like people don't understand that they did good work there, and a lot of their reputations have been tarnished. Some of them got death threats after the police information came out through the courts from, stalwart Ford Nation people. All of those young people that worked for me, mostly young, some of them my age, a couple of them, they did fantastic work, and they are suffering for it still, some of them, but they were brilliant. They did everything they could to enable this guy to accomplish what he was elected to do without crossing any lines.
What are you doing now?
I'm consulting with the company Ballacane Strategy and Execution, back into management consulting, mostly for business, occasionally for political leaders like Patrick Brown, and finished writing once. So I'm not an author anymore. I guess that's done.
Would you ever want to be chief of staff to another candidate or another official?
I don't think so. It would depend on who it is, and it would depend in what office. But right now I'm focused on heaping stacks of cash. And unfortunately, the book isn't part of that plan, but the business
Live in
is.
hope.
Hey, you're writing the screenplay, right? When you sell the screenplay rights for a movie, then you'll make some cash.
HBO miniseries.
There you go. It's a very, very distressing but very readable book. Thank you very much, both of you, for coming in tonight. Mark Towhey, former Chief of Staff to Mayor Rob Ford. Johanna Schneller, who co-authored Mayor Rob Ford, Uncontrollable, How I Tried to Help the World's Most Notorious Mayor. Good to see you, too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.